A quick note before we begin, I've started a new channel dedicated to my comedy content called Smiling Pariah. It's linked in the description below. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks. This is part 2 of the Austin Yogurt Shop Murders episode. To see part 1, please see a link in the description below. When Officer Frank Wilson and his rookie partner conducted a traffic stop on the night of December 23, 2010, the tragic homicide of 4 teenage girls at a yogurt shop likely never crossed their minds. The same cannot be said for Maurice Pierce, one of the young men who was suspected of the crime. Pierce suffered from intense anxiety and paranoia relating to law enforcement. When the officers pulled him over, Maurice ran. Wilson pursued Maurice on foot, but when he caught up, a struggle ensued. Pierce grabbed a knife from the officer's belt and stabbed wildly. He cut into Wilson's neck, severing his carotid artery. Despite his injuries, the officer was able to draw his firearm and shot his attacker. Officer Frank Wilson survived the injuries he sustained that night. However, Maurice Pierce did not. Maurice died afraid and alone. His greatest fears realized. But his paranoia and distrust of law enforcement had a history, and it was one that would leave most anyone traumatized as well. But his trauma, unfortunately, would be his undoing. In this episode of Anatomy of Murder, the mishandling of this infamous case is steeped in coercion, corruption, and forced confessions. So let's begin. Are you stuck in the house, forced into social distancing from other human beings? Or maybe you're like me, and you've been doing that for years because you're a recluse who is destroying all of his personal relationships. Well, then you're in luck, because I've got a way for you to spend your time. That's right, you little disease-carrying parasites. I'm talking about our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, a dark fantasy RPG you can play on your phone or on your PC, and I didn't mean to rhyme that. And the best part, it's free to play and actually has work put into it, unlike those mobile game farms you see cranking out the worst possible games ever with stick figures shooting arrows at other stick figures. Nope, this is the real deal. Actual talent, a real game. It's kind of like a throwback to old turn-based RPGs, and those make me frisky AF. And now they've got this thing called Battle Pass going on. Season 1 is live, and you can win badass rewards like gems, upgraded artifacts, legendary champions, and more by taking on the daily and weekly challenges. You can find me being my squirrely little self under the nickname Gavagan. So jump up, and get down to the video description below and hit the special links. New players get 200,000 silver and 1 free champion, Tree Feller, who seems like she has a problem with trees. I don't personally, but she looks pretty awesome, so you'll find your extra rewards in your inbox for the next 30 days only, so move it or lose it, baby girl. Hit those links and check out Raid, because when you support them, you're supporting me, and I need it, trust me. Thanks for listening, and now, on to the episode. When the original investigators were promoted, the yogurt shop murders fell onto the shoulders of other officers. On August 6, 1999, 6 investigators were assigned the case and began dissecting all of the old leads. One of these leads had been the arrest of a young Maurice Pierce. In 1991, 8 days after the murders, Pierce was arrested in the North Cross Mall for carrying a loaded .22 caliber revolver. Maurice was only 16 at the time and had bragged to his friend Forrest Wellborn that the gun had been used in the murder. However, upon interrogation, the lead didn't pan out, and the ballistics for the gun didn't match. Despite that fact, the new investigators decided to pursue Maurice Pierce as a suspect along with his 3 friends, Forrest Wellborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott. In 1991, the four friends had only been teenagers. Both Springsteen and Scott were 17, Pierce was a year younger, and Forrest Wellborn was the youngest of the group at 15 years old. Springsteen was described as being someone who would always speak their mind, while in contrast, Forrest was thought to be soft-spoken. Michael faced some more unique challenges. He was enrolled in special education and had to repeat the 10th grade. He was, however, considered the joker of the group. The teens were not angels, and all eventually dropped out of high school and had some minor run-ins with the law. In fact, just days after the murders, the group admitted to joyriding, driving around at dangerous speeds recklessly. However, none of the boys were ever known to be violent. The detectives thought differently, however. It's not clear why they chose to zero in on these four men, but within a month of renewing the investigation, they managed to get a confession from one of them. How the officers managed to get that confession is what would eventually throw the entire case into turmoil. Michael Scott was picked up by Austin police in the parking lot at his wife's work. Over the course of 11 hours of being interviewed, Scott would tell the detectives that he and his friends had gone to the yogurt shop in order to rob the business and had murdered the girls in the process. He claimed they had set the fire in order to cover their tracks. In total, Scott was interrogated over 20 hours in the span of a few days, and once officers had gotten him to admit to going to the yogurt shop that day, they weren't willing to let up on their lead. Investigators would repeatedly feed Scott information throughout their questioning. On one occasion, an officer would leak a critical fact when he asked, "So one of the girls you're saying was shot twice?" Scott said nothing about this up to that time, but he soon confirmed this fact for the officers. In fact, during the interview, he would repeatedly get facts wrong, only to correct them with continued prodding from the police, who dispensed leading question after leading question. He first said that the victims were clothed, then he said that they were partially naked, then fully naked. He said that the girls' hands were tied with an electric extension cord, then with napkins, then with shirts or jeans or undergarments. Scott had suggested that the girls had been strangled, bludgeoned, kicked, stabbed, and shot. He even inaccurately stated that one of the girls had been killed behind the shop counter. At one point, an investigator even verbally attacked Scott, saying, "Do you want to live with this the rest of your f***ing life?" and followed it by insinuating that his friends had already implicated him in the murders.
Mike, look at me. You're remembering what happened because you were inside there, right? I don't. You're remembering what happened. I don't honestly remember going in the building. If you were in the building, you went in there with me. I don't believe that, Michael. You do remember going in there. And you know you were in there. Did you shoot any of those girls? No, sir. Then tell us what happened. What did those two boys do to those girls? You want to live with this the rest of your life? No, I don't. Then get it out right now. They're you over. They're the ones that shot the girls. Do it. What did you see happen?
The most serious incident to take place during Scott's questioning occurred on the second day. Officers decided to confront him with the .22 caliber revolver that Maurice Pierce was carrying when he was arrested after the murders. An investigator showed the gun to Michael Scott and then proceeded to walk behind him. The officer put the gun to Scott's head and asked him if that was the weapon he used to shoot someone. Only at that point did Scott say yes to the officer's question.
That brought back some memories, didn't it?
I remember looking at the gun.
Have you ever seen that gun before?
I'm not positive.
Does that look like a gun you've seen before?
It looks like a gun I've seen before, but I'm not positive.
Is that the gun you shot somebody with, Mike?
I don't.
Is that the gun you walked up behind somebody with and shot in the head? Is that the one? Talk to me, Mike.
Yes, sir.
You did that, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
We've stolen some more doors, haven't we, Mike?
Not really.
You sure?
Yes, sir.
A few minutes later, he was given a 30-minute break. When questioning resumed, Scott told the officer, "You scared the shit out of me." The officer replied, "I meant to scare the shit out of you." With Michael Scott's confession in hand, the police began to build a case against the other men who they claimed had been at the scene that night. Robert Springsteen was brought in for questioning. He fiercely claimed his innocence during the interview to begin with, steadfast that he had not been there that night, no matter how the police continued to claim that he had been.
The problem is,
Then
we got to get
what
this
are
straight.
our options?
Our
I
options
cannot
are,
give you any more truth than I've already given. Where do we go from here?
why can't you? Because
Because I don't
you're going to
remember.
dig yourself into that thing? Well, you're already there. You've already dug the hole. The hole's there.
Oh, then I'm in it. I don't know. That's what I keep telling you guys. I mean, my God, this was 7 years ago.
But this is one of the most significant things that ever happened in your life.
That's what I keep trying to explain to you. If I was there and I partook in this, I would remember these things.
And you do remember these things.
No, I don't. No, I do not.
You're the coldest guy I've ever talked to in my life. Are you a cold-blooded murderer?
No, sir, I'm not.
I think you are. I think Maurice is absolutely true about you.
Well, then let's
You're the coldest guy I've ever talked
we need
to.
to take.
Pardon me?
Then let's take whatever actions we need to take. If that's what you believe and that's where you think this case needs to go, then let's go there.
We don't want to go there.
But I'm doing everything I can and have exceeded my limits of helping you guys. Where do we go now?
Eventually, similar to Scott, Robert caved into the police and confessed. When reflecting on the interrogation, Springsteen was quoted as saying, "I was berated and berated and berated by the police officers until they obtained what it was they wanted to hear. They were not going to allow me to leave, and basically, they broke me down."
What else? What else is here? Yeah, you did. You did? You're there. That's what you are there. You weren't there, right?
Through their tactics of fear and intimidation, police were able to implicate the four men in the crime. With the confessions in hand, investigators would build their case to explain what had happened the night of the yogurt shop murders. According to the confessions, the four boys were at the food court in North Cross Mall on the night of December 6, 1991. Maurice Pierce mentioned that he needed money and allegedly suggested committing a robbery. The young men left the mall and began to drive around the neighborhood in Pierce's car, and it was decided that the yogurt shop would be the location for the robbery. Later that night, 3 of the teens entered the shop through the back door, which had been propped open by Robert with an empty pack of cigarettes earlier in the day. Michael Scott said he heard one of the girls say to Pierce that the money had been dropped into the safe, and then heard one of the girls get slapped. Investigators linked this to the bruise on Amy Ayer's lower lip. Springsteen asked Scott to come help him in the back of the shop. When he entered, he found Springsteen removing the girls' clothes. The girls were crying and begging not to be killed, so Scott decided to gag them, using something he remembered as white like terry cloth. Scott claimed he returned to the front of the shop, and that's when he heard Pierce shout, "Where the f*** is the rest of the money?" followed by a gunshot. Scott went to the back of the shop to see what had happened and found one of the girls dead. Pierce repeated his demand for money to a second girl, then there was a second gunshot. Meanwhile, Springsteen was assaulting one of the other girls. When Scott walked in on this, Springsteen told him to do one of the other girls. Afraid of what Springsteen might do, Scott complied and pretended to have sex with the girl. Pierce later handed Scott the revolver and told him to finish her. Scott confessed that he had pointed the gun at the back of the girl's head and fired. Robert told Scott to burn the place. Scott recounted how he gathered up napkins, cups, and other items and piled them on top of the bodies before spraying them with lighter fluid. He lit the blaze and ran out to the car that Wellborn had kept running for them. The men drove off into the night, only $540 richer for their efforts, and all at the expense of ending 4 young girls' lives. Nearly a decade after the murders, the trials began. Both Scott and Springsteen signed written confessions implicating each other. Prosecutors used Springsteen's confession and corroborated it with parts of Michael Scott's written confession to build their case. For 3 weeks, the families listened to the horrible recounting of the murders. The parents of the victims were convinced that the police had arrested the right men and that Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott had killed their little girls. In May of 2001, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jurors agreed and convicted Robert Springsteen of the capital murder of Amy Ayers and sentenced him to death. The following year, Michael Scott was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were also arrested on 4 counts of capital murder. However, Wellborn was released when a jury failed to indict him, and Pierce was released when the district attorney announced that there was not enough evidence to secure a conviction. Unfortunately, his release didn't do much to calm the trauma he had instilled in his mind after such horrifying circumstances, and he would only be killed sometime later when pulled aside by police. Because of what law enforcement had already done to him before, he became scared and desperate, and it cost him his life. Both men appealed their convictions and unflinchingly claimed their innocence. They cited the improper interrogation techniques as the reason for their confessions. A judge did agree that the tactics used by officers went against protocol, but did not constitute throwing out the confessions. However, after years behind bars, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the conviction of Robert Springsteen and subsequently Michael Scott. The ruling stated that the men's confessions were improperly used in the trials because the defense had no prior opportunity to cross-examine the statements, and it went against their Sixth Amendment right to confront the witness. The pair were not found innocent, but as their rights had been violated, a judge ordered them to be released pending possible retrials. Those retrials were put on hold when DNA evidence that had been found on one of the girls did not match any of the suspect's DNA. Springsteen filed a wrongful conviction case seeking compensation in the sum of $720,000 for his 9 years behind bars. Due to the legal limbo of the conviction being overturned but not being found innocent, the men have not been completely exonerated and therefore have not received any compensation for the years that they were incarcerated. To this day, many citizens of Austin still believe these men to be cold-blooded murderers who got away with their crime, and until the case has been solved and the perpetrators imprisoned, the crimes will continue to hang over their heads. The sad fact remains that to this day, the senseless death of 4 innocent girls remains unsolved. Their murderers never faced justice for extinguishing the life of Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. Their loss is felt by their family and the community alike. However, a hope remains. DNA evidence collected that night may still lead to the killer and a conviction. The Austin police are adamant that the case has not been forgotten and that they are committed to seeking justice for the victims and their families. All anyone can do is wait and hope for justice to be served, not only for the surviving loved ones left behind for so long without any true answers, but for those who lost their lives so tragically early, and for those wrongfully accused, whose lives have been destroyed over the actions of another. If you have any information about these crimes, please call Austin Crimestoppers at 512-472-TIPS or the APD Cold Case Unit at 512-477-3588. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. And don't forget to subscribe to my new channel, linked in the description below. And I'll see you next time.